It was Antonio Mendoza's 60th birthday. One of Spain's richest men, and his mansion in La Moraleja was prepared for the most luxurious party of the year. But Antonio hadn't arrived in a limousine, as everyone expected. He had arrived on foot, in torn clothes, with a tattered blanket over his shoulders, looking like a homeless man who hadn't eaten in days. For the last 3 months, he had pretended to have lost everything, to have been swindled and reduced to poverty, just to see how his family would react. His wife, his children, his grandchildren, all had been unknowingly put to the test. When he showed up at the mansion's front door, his eldest son looked at him with disgust and ordered security to throw him out. His wife laughed and said it was a tasteless joke. Only one person recognized him. And that person ran to hug him, crying. She was the one person he hadn't expected. What Antonio discovered that day about his family shocked him more than anything he had experienced in his 60 years of life. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Antonio Mendoza was 60 years old and had a net worth exceeding €2 billion. He had started with nothing, the son of a farmer from the mountains of Asturias who had never owned more than his own calloused hands and an unbreakable dignity. At 18, he had arrived in Madrid with a cardboard suitcase and 20,000 pesetas in his pocket, determined to build a life different from the one fate seemed to have assigned him in the mining village where he was born. He started as a laborer in a textile factory in Getafe, working 12-hour shifts for a salary that barely covered a rented room and 2 meals a day. But Antonio had something money couldn't buy, a brilliant mind and a determination that knew no obstacles or defeat. He studied at night in the public library. He learned everything there was to know about the industry. He saved every cent until he could open his first small import-export business at 28. From there, it had been an unstoppable climb to the top of the Spanish business world. The company grew, diversified, and acquired other companies. By 40, Antonio Mendoza was a millionaire, and his name was beginning to be heard in Madrid's power circles. At 50, he owned an empire spanning real estate, technology, fashion, and renewable energy. His name regularly appeared on lists of Spain's and Europe's most influential businessmen. The country's most important politicians sought his advice and support. But while his wealth grew year after year, something inside him had been slowly eroding, without him noticing. He had married Isabel 30 years earlier, when he was still a young, ambitious entrepreneur with more ambition than money. She was beautiful, ambitious, perfect for the role of a powerful man's wife. She had given him 3 children, Carlos, the firstborn, Pablo, the second, and Lucia, the youngest. Antonio had worked so hard to give them everything he never had that he missed their birthdays, school plays, the important moments of their lives. And now, at 60, he looked around and wondered if anyone in that family truly loved him for who he was, or only for what he possessed. His children visited only when they needed money for some new indulgence. His wife seemed more interested in credit cards than in him as a person. His grandchildren called him Grandpa only on official occasions, when photographers were present to capture the image of the perfect family. It had all become an empty performance, a gilded farce masking a total absence of genuine affection. The idea was born one sleepless night 3 months before his 60th birthday. He lay awake in the marital bed of the La Moraleja mansion, listening to Isabel's regular breathing beside him, and wondered what would happen if he one day lost everything. Who would stay by his side? Who would help him? Who would still love him? So he devised a plan, a crazy, perhaps cruel, but undoubtedly necessary plan to learn the truth. He would pretend to have lost everything, to have been the victim of a colossal swindle that left him in absolute poverty. He would live like a poor man for 3 months, observing from afar how his family reacted to the news. Then, on his birthday, he would show up at the party his wife was organizing, dressed as a homeless man, to see with his own eyes who his real family was. Only his trusted lawyer and personal doctor knew the truth. Everyone else, including his wife, children, and employees, believed Antonio Mendoza had truly been ruined by a disastrous investment and had disappeared out of shame. The first weeks after the announcement of the supposed bankruptcy were revealing in ways Antonio could never have imagined, despite his worst suspicions about the family he had built and maintained for 30 years. He had leaked the news through reliable channels, ensuring it seemed absolutely authentic and indisputable. Financial newspapers had published the story of Antonio Mendoza's financial collapse. Victim of an international swindle orchestrated by a Swiss investment fund that had left him with nothing but debt and public shame. Television stations had run reports on his downfall, interviewing experts who analyzed how one of Spain's richest men could lose everything in a few weeks. Isabel had reacted with a cold, calculating fury that cleared up any lingering doubt about her true feelings for the man with whom she had shared 30 years of married life. She hadn't shed a single tear, hadn't shown the slightest concern for her missing husband, hadn't organized searches or contacted the police to report his disappearance. Her one and only concern had been to save whatever she could of the family fortune before the creditors arrived. Transferring assets to her name through offshore companies her lawyer suggested, consulting Madrid's best divorce lawyers to understand how to legally protect herself from what she already considered a terminated marriage. Antonio, watching it all through detailed reports from his private investigator, felt his heart slowly break as he saw the woman with whom he had shared 3 decades of life behave as if he were already dead and buried, as if the only thing that mattered was saving her own lifestyle at all costs. Not a single moment of genuine grief, not a single tear shed in private, not a single attempt to look for him or understand what had happened to him. Just cold calculations and legal maneuvers to protect her own financial interests. Carlos, the eldest son and supposed heir to the Mendoza empire, reacted even worse than his mother, if that were possible. He was 40. He nominally worked in the family business with a pompous title and an astronomical salary, but in reality, he spent his days at exclusive golf courses, private clubs, and vacations in exotic destinations with his occasional lovers. When he learned of his father's financial collapse, his first and only reaction had been pure and simple rage. Not rage for his missing father, whose whereabouts were unknown. Not concern for his health or safety. But blind rage for the lost inheritance he already considered rightfully his. He immediately called his personal lawyers to understand if he could somehow claim his father's assets, if there was anything to salvage for himself before the creditors took everything. He even explored the possibility of having his father declared legally dead to speed up the inheritance process. He made not a single attempt to look for Antonio. He showed not the slightest concern for his fate. He didn't even pretend to be sad for the cameras that occasionally gathered outside the mansion. Pablo, the Mendoza family's second son, was not much better than his older brother, only slightly more discreet in his selfish reactions. At 35, he ran a chain of luxury restaurants in Madrid, financed entirely with his father's money, a chain that was already failing miserably despite the continuous financial bailouts Antonio had provided over the years, turning a blind eye to the disastrous balance sheets. His reaction to the news of his father's ruin had been the selfish, total panic of someone who sees their lifestyle collapsing without ever having done anything to build it for themselves. Only Lucia, the youngest daughter and black sheep of the Mendoza family, reacted completely differently from everyone else. She was 30. She was the family rebel, the one who had categorically rejected her father's money from a young age to build her own career as a surgeon at a public hospital in Vallecas. She didn't earn much. She lived in a modest apartment, drove a used car, but was proud of what she had built with her own hands and her own intelligence. When Lucia learned of her father's disappearance, she did something no other family member had even slightly considered. She looked for him with all the means at her disposal. For 3 months, Antonio Mendoza lived a life he never imagined possible for someone like him. He moved into a furnished room in a working-class neighborhood of Lavapiés, paying in cash under a false name. He let his beard grow until it completely covered his face. He wore second-hand clothes bought at the Rastro flea markets. He learned to move through the city like an invisible ghost that no one looked at twice. It was an experience that changed him to the depths of his soul in ways he never would have anticipated. For the first time in 40 years, no one recognized him, no one bowed as he passed, No one sought his favors or gave him fake smiles expecting something in return. He was just another struggling older man, one of the many invisible people who populate the streets of big cities, unseen and unconsidered. He discovered kindness where he least expected it. The owner of the bar below his room, a simple man from Andalusia with a thick Seville accent, often offered him a free coffee when he saw him looking particularly downcast or when the winter mornings were cold. A young woman who worked at a laundromat had given him a thick jacket when she saw him shivering on a December night. Strangers who had nothing gave him more human warmth than his wealthy family had ever given him in his entire rich life. He also discovered how quickly the world forgets those who fall from grace. His former business friends, the ones who once queued to sit at his table in Madrid's most exclusive restaurants, had completely disappeared from his life. None of them had tried to contact him. None had offered to help with even the slightest show of solidarity. It was as if Antonio Mendoza had never existed, erased from collective memory along with his fortune and power. Meanwhile, he watched his family prepare for his 60th birthday party. Through his private investigators' reports, Isabel had decided to go ahead with it anyway, transforming it into a kind of commemoration of the missing husband that served more to keep up appearances than to honor his memory. But Antonio knew the real reason was something very different. She wanted to show the world. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. That the Mendoza family was still powerful and relevant, that they were doing well despite everything that had happened. The party would be as ostentatious as ever, with hundreds of guests from Madrid's high society, rivers of champagne, a live orchestra, and a menu designed by a Michelin-starred chef. Isabel had even commissioned a portrait of Antonio to hang in the main hall. A gesture that might have seemed touching if Antonio hadn't known it was just a public relations maneuver to maintain the image of a devoted wife. But there was one person who wasn't participating in the party preparations. Lucia had declined her mother's invitation, saying she couldn't celebrate while her father was still missing without a trace. She had continued looking for him every weekend she had free from the hospital, scouring the streets of Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao. Anywhere she thought a desperate man who had lost everything might have gone. Antonio decided the time for the final truth had come. On the day of Antonio Mendoza's 60th birthday, the La Moraleja mansion shone like a jewel under the September sun. Hundreds of guests had arrived from all over Spain and abroad. Businessmen whose names appeared on the front pages of financial newspapers, top-level politicians moving discreetly among the tables seeking alliances, celebrities from the entertainment world, aristocrats with surnames dating back to the time of the Catholic monarchs. Limousines lined the driveway like a parade of obscene luxury. Waiters served champagne on silver trays. An orchestra played classical music in the immense garden decorated with exotic flowers specially brought from Holland. Isabel was in her natural element, wearing a red haute couture dress signed by a famous Spanish designer and jewelry she would have had to return if things had really gone bad. She greeted guests with a smile she had practiced for hours in front of the mirror. She accepted condolences for her missing husband with a perfectly calibrated sadness that never reached her empty eyes. Carlos and Pablo were at her side, also impeccably dressed in Italian suits worth thousands of euros, also playing the part of devastated sons while really only thinking about how to divide what was left of the family empire. It was at that moment that Antonio appeared at the mansion's gates. The security guard saw him first, an older man with a long, unkempt, completely white beard, dirty, torn clothes that smelled of the street, a tattered blanket over his shoulders. The unmistakable look of someone who had been living on the streets for months. The guard moved to throw him out immediately, but the man said he had come for the party, that he was the guest of honor. The guard laughed incredulously and called the head of security, convinced he was dealing with a madman or a vagrant looking for free food. The head of security was a former police officer who had worked for the Mendozas for 20 years and knew Antonio from the beginning, but not even he recognized his former boss under the unkempt beard and grimy clothes. He was about to have him forcibly removed when Carlos came out to see what all the commotion was about. Antonio's eldest son looked at the man who claimed to be his father with a mixture of disgust and irritation he didn't bother to hide. He didn't recognize him. Or perhaps he didn't want to recognize him, because doing so would have meant accepting an uncomfortable reality. He told security to take that beggar away before the guests saw him, that it was a disgrace for people like that to show up at a private party of that caliber. Antonio felt those words like daggers to his heart, but he remained silent. He wanted to see how far his own children would go. Pablo came out shortly after, drawn by the growing commotion. He, too, looked at his father without recognizing him, or without wanting to recognize him. He said it was probably one of those scammers who pretend to be relatives to extort money from rich families and that security should call the police immediately to have him taken away in custody. Then Isabel came out. The woman who had been his wife for 30 years approached with a perfectly rehearsed expression of aristocratic disgust. She looked Antonio up and down. She noticed the torn clothes, the unkempt beard, the dirty hands. There was not the slightest recognition in her cold eyes, no glimmer of familiarity with the man who had slept beside her for 3 decades. She said it was a very tasteless joke, that someone was trying to ruin the party, and ordered security to make that man disappear immediately before the journalists photographed him. Antonio was about to speak, to reveal everything, when he heard shouting coming from the street. Lucia had arrived at the mansion against her own will, convinced at the last moment by a friend from the hospital who told her she should at least show up out of respect for her father's memory, even if only for a few minutes. She had parked her old used car at the end of the driveway, feeling completely out of place among the luxury limousines and sports cars worth hundreds of thousands of euros. And she was walking toward the entrance when she saw the scene at the mansion's gates. She saw an older man surrounded by security as if he were a dangerous criminal. She saw her mother and brothers looking at him with undisguised contempt. She saw the guards about to forcibly take him away as he offered no resistance. And something in the way that man kept his shoulders straight despite everything, in the way he stood with dignity despite the humiliations, made her heart beat harder and faster. She ran over as fast as her legs would carry her, pushing the guards aside despite their protests, and stopped in front of the man with the long beard and dirty clothes. She looked into his eyes, the eyes she had known since she was born, the eyes that had looked at her with silent pride on the day of her medical school graduation, even though he had never said it in words. The eyes she would recognize anywhere in the world, no matter how much the face around them had changed. Lucia understood immediately what was happening. Beneath the unkempt beard, beneath the tattered, dirty clothes, beneath the appearance of a homeless man living on the street, was her father. The man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had gotten lost while trying to give everything to his family, the man she had searched for 3 months without ever giving up, even when everyone told her it was useless to keep trying. She broke down in sobs that shook her entire body and hugged him with all her strength, ignoring the astonished looks of the others, not caring if she stained the nice dress she had worn for the occasion. She called him Dad between uncontrollable sobs, clinging to him as if afraid he might disappear again if she let go for even a second. The silence that followed was deafening and absolute. Isabel paled as if she had seen a ghost, because, in a sense, that's exactly what she was seeing. Carlos and Pablo exchanged looks of pure terror, suddenly understanding what they had done, what they had said, how they had behaved toward their own father without recognizing him. The guests who had approached to see what was happening murmured confusedly among themselves, trying to understand if what they were seeing was real or some kind of elaborate spectacle. Antonio returned his daughter's hug, feeling tears run down his cheeks for the first time in decades. In that moment, he knew he had found what he was looking for, though not in the way he had expected. He had discovered that in that huge, dysfunctional family, there was only one person who truly loved him. Only one person who had cared about him when everything seemed lost. He gently pulled away from Lucia's embrace and turned toward the rest of the family, toward that wife and those sons who had looked at him without recognition, who had ordered him thrown out like a bothersome stray dog. The weeks that followed were an earthquake that shook the Mendoza family to its foundations. Antonio wasted no time implementing the consequences of his discovery, acting with the same relentless determination that had led him to build his empire from nothing. Isabel received divorce papers 3 days after the party. Antonio was generous in the financial settlement, not out of affection, but because he didn't want to drag things out in endless legal battles that would only benefit the lawyers. He gave her enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but nothing more. The La Moraleja mansion, the one where she had planned to continue her life of luxury as if nothing had happened, was sold to a foreign businessman. Carlos was removed from any position in the family company with immediate effect. Antonio informed him he would have to find a real job for the first time in his 40 years of privileged life. He left him a small trust fund that would only unlock when he had demonstrated he could hold a job for at least 2 consecutive years without anyone's help. Carlos reacted with rage, threatening legal action and media scandals, but his lawyers explained he had no grounds to contest his father's decisions, who remained the absolute owner of everything. Pablo lost the funding for his restaurant chain, which went bankrupt in a matter of weeks without his father's money artificially keeping it afloat. Antonio offered him the same condition as his brother: he would help only when Pablo had demonstrated he could work seriously for himself. Pablo, less proud than Carlos, accepted a job as a waiter at one of his former restaurants, determined to show his father he could change and earn his respect. But it was with Lucia that Antonio built something completely new and unexpected. The daughter he had always neglected, the one he had considered a rebel for rejecting his money, turned out to be the only person worthy of his legacy. Antonio modified his will, leaving Lucia the majority of the fortune, with the sole condition that she continue her work as a doctor and use the wealth to help others. Father and daughter began spending time together, making up for lost years. Antonio visited her at the hospital, took her to dinner, told her stories of his youth in Asturias. He discovered in her an extraordinary woman, intelligent, compassionate, everything he had always hoped his children would become. 1 year after that dramatic party, Antonio organized another birthday celebration. But this time it was very different. There weren't hundreds of guests, no limousines, or expensive champagne. It was just him and Lucia, sitting on the terrace of the new house he had bought, a modest villa overlooking the mountains of Asturias, not far from the village where he was born. Antonio watched the sunset paint the sky orange over those mountains he had known since childhood. And he told his daughter that those 3 months as a fake poor man had taught him more than 60 years as a rich man. Lucia took his hand and told him she was grateful, not for the money, but for finally showing her who he really was. This story teaches us that money can buy many things, but not true love or loyalty. Antonio spent a lifetime building an empire, believing that giving his children everything was the best way to love them. Instead, he only taught them to love his riches, not him. But it also teaches us that it's never too late to discover the truth. Antonio had the courage to test his family, and that truth allowed him to find what he was looking for. Lucia represents the hope that even in the most dysfunctional families, there can be someone who chooses true love over self-interest. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey.